You're about to see how one tiny mistake can sink empires. Not dramatic decisions, not evil masterminds, just small, boring, everyday screw-ups. A forgotten switch, a misplaced decimal, a single unchecked checkbox. They've crashed planes, blacked out continents, and almost started nuclear war. Governments blamed systems. Companies blamed unforeseen factors. But the trigger was microscopic. And the scariest part is, these disasters felt normal until seconds before. So what happens when a sleepy tech, clerk, or captain slips? Tonight, we'll rewind those ordinary moments and watch everything quietly fall apart. Because sometimes the end of the world starts with one click. Chernobyl meltdown triggered by one botched late-night safety test. The worst nuclear disaster in history began as routine testing. In 1986, Soviet engineers at Chernobyl pushed Reactor 4 dangerously low. They tried a late-night safety test on the Ukrainian power plant. To keep turbines spinning, operators disabled automatic shutdowns and key safety systems. Control rods were yanked, alarms screamed, and the reactor became wildly unstable. A massive steam explosion blew the reactor building apart before anyone understood. Graphite from the core burned, flinging radioactive debris high overhead. Firefighters from Pripyat arrived unprotected, assuming it was a routine blaze. For days, radioactive clouds drifted across Europe as officials downplayed everything. Challenger shuttle destroyed because one rubber O-ring couldn't seal. 7 astronauts died on live television because of a ring of rubber. In January 1986, Challenger sat on a freezing Florida launch pad. Engineers at Morton Thiokol had warned about O-ring performance in cold. Despite concerns, NASA managers pushed ahead, chasing schedules and political pressure. When the solid rocket boosters ignited, hot gases leaked past the brittle seal. A bright flame licked the booster joint, slicing into the external fuel tank. 73 seconds after liftoff, the shuttle disintegrated over the Atlantic Ocean. Schoolchildren watched as teacher Krista McAuliffe's mission ended in falling debris. The disaster forced NASA to confront how a tiny part masked massive risk. Titanic's lookouts had no binoculars on the iceberg watch. A supposedly unsinkable luxury liner sank after brushing one chunk of ice. In 1912, RMS Titanic steamed across the North Atlantic toward New York. Up in the crow's nest, lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee scanned darkness. Their binoculars were locked away because a key holder missed the voyage. Without magnification, they spotted the iceberg dangerously late on that moonless night. First Officer William Murdoch ordered a hard turn and engines reversed immediately. The ship still scraped along the iceberg, ripping open multiple watertight compartments. Wealthy passengers kept socializing, while crew quietly readied lifeboats on deck. Within hours, the pride of the White Star Line disappeared beneath freezing water. Mars Climate Orbiter lost over a simple metric, imperial unit mix-up. A $125 million spacecraft vanished at Mars because numbers spoke different languages. In 1999, NASA's Mars Climate Orbiter approached the planet after long interplanetary travel. Navigation software from Lockheed Martin sent thrust data in pound-seconds, not Newton-seconds. NASA's navigation team assumed the data was metric and never converted anything. Each tiny trajectory correction nudged the probe lower than planners actually realized. By the time controllers noticed odd readings, the spacecraft was already skimming atmosphere. It likely dipped too low, overheated, and broke apart behind Mars itself. There was no dramatic explosion, just silence where telemetry should have appeared. One unchecked units document became the most expensive math homework error imaginable. Apollo 13's oxygen tank exploded after one switch was damaged. NASA's successful failure started with a hidden wiring scar in one tank. Apollo 13 left Florida in 1970, aiming for another moon landing. An earlier ground test had overheated an oxygen tank, damaging its internal wiring. No one realized the thermostat contacts were literally welded together inside. Days into flight, Jack Swigert stirred the cryogenic tanks on command. A spark inside Tank 2 ignited oxygen, blowing off a side panel. Jim Lovell famously reported a problem while their spacecraft vented life support. The crew crammed into the tiny lunar module, using it as lifeboat. Careful improvisation and power-saving tricks brought them safely back to Earth. Columbia shuttle doomed when one foam chunk hit the wing. The Columbia tragedy began with a puff of foam hardly anyone noticed. During launch in 2003, insulating foam broke free from the external fuel tank. A suitcase-sized piece slammed into the shuttle's left wing near the leading edge. Engineers saw grainy launch footage, but weren't certain how bad damage was. Requests for military imaging were debated, delayed, and eventually never fully pursued. For 16 days, the crew orbited Earth, unaware of the missing wing section. On re-entry over Texas, superheated plasma poured through the hidden breach. The wing structure failed, and Columbia broke apart in the upper atmosphere. Pieces rained down over several states while investigators traced everything back to foam. 3 Mile Island crisis began with one stuck cooling system valve. America's worst commercial nuclear accident began with equipment that simply refused closing. In 1979, at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, a relief valve stuck open. It quietly vented coolant from the reactor while control room gauges misled operators. One misleading indicator suggested the valve had closed, even though it hadn't. Concerned about overfilling the reactor, operators actually reduced cooling water further. Steam and gas formed at the core, exposing fuel rods to heat. Within hours, the plant suffered a partial meltdown and serious radiation release. Residents heard confusing messages as helicopters and TV crews swarmed the area. The incident reshaped American attitudes toward nuclear power and plant control room design. Ariane 5 rocket self-destructed from one integer conversion software bug. A European rocket exploded 40 seconds after launch because of a programming assumption. In 1996, the first Ariane 5 thundered off from French Guiana with satellites. Its guidance system reused software written earlier for the slower Ariane 4. The new rocket accelerated faster, pushing numbers beyond the old program's limits. A horizontal velocity value overflowed when converted from a 64-bit float. The software tried squeezing it into a 16-bit integer and crashed immediately. The guidance computer shut down, and backup systems dutifully copied the same failure. Without valid guidance, Ariane 5 veered off course and self-destructed over the jungle. One unchecked data type turned years of engineering into an expensive fireworks display. Deepwater Horizon blowout followed one misread pressure test result. The worst marine oil spill in history hinged on a single test. In 2010, the Deepwater Horizon rig drilled BP's Macondo well in the Gulf. Before temporarily abandoning the well, crews ran a negative pressure test for safety. Readings from the drill pipe and kill line didn't match, signaling something wrong. Some managers interpreted the confusing numbers as a bladder effect, not a leak. Believing the well secure, they displaced heavy drilling mud with much lighter seawater. Gas surged up the wellbore, past barriers that should have been sealed tight. It erupted onto the rig, ignited, and engulfed the platform in flames. After the rig sank, oil gushed from the seafloor for weeks. Northeast blackout cascaded from one overheated line brushing a tree. 50 million people lost power because one line got too cozy with leaves. On a hot August day in 2003, demand surged across the northeastern grid. In Ohio, a high-voltage transmission line sagged as it heated under heavy load. It dipped into an untrimmed tree, faulted, and shut down automatically. Control room software at First Energy failed to alarm operators about the growing problem. Grid controllers didn't reroute power quickly, so other lines started overloading nearby. One failure cascaded into many, triggering protective relays across multiple American states. Within minutes, major cities like New York and Toronto plunged into darkness. The blackout exposed how ordinary vegetation management can make or break giant systems. Gimli glider ran out of fuel after a unit conversion error. An Air Canada flight became a glider because someone miscounted kilograms and pounds. In 1983, a brand new Boeing 767 left Montreal heading for Edmonton. Ground crews needed to calculate fuel manually because the gauge was malfunctioning. They used the wrong conversion factor, loading roughly half the required fuel. Over Manitoba, both engines flamed out at high altitude, terrifying passengers instantly. Captain Robert Pearson and First Officer Maurice Quintal suddenly commanded a powerless airliner. They aimed for a former Air Force base at Gimli, now a racetrack. The plane glided silently in, narrowly missing people gathered for weekend drag races. It touched down hard, but everyone walked away from the improvised landing. Tape left on static ports sent Aero Peru flight blind at night. One forgotten piece of tape made an entire jet's instruments lie at once. In 1996, Aero Peru Flight 603 departed Lima on a routine nighttime flight. Ground workers had covered the static ports with adhesive tape during cleaning work. Afterward, nobody removed the tape or recorded the temporary covering in documentation. Once airborne over the Pacific, the blocked ports fed nonsense to flight computers. Airspeed, altitude, and vertical speed indicators gave conflicting, impossible readings simultaneously. Alarms blared in the cockpit while the crew battled contradictory instructions and warnings. Disoriented in darkness with false data, the pilots lost control of the Boeing. The aircraft crashed into the ocean, all from tape smaller than a postcard. Tenerife airport disaster sparked by one misheard takeoff clearance phrase. History's deadliest aviation accident hinged on a few misunderstood English words. In 1977, two fully loaded Boeing 747s waited at foggy Los Rodeos Airport. A KLM jet and a Pan Am jet shared the same runway. Captain Jacob Veldhausen von Zanten believed he'd received clearance for takeoff already. His first officer's doubts were brushed aside as radio chatter overlapped on frequency. Controllers said, "Stand by for takeoff," but the captain heard confirmation instead. In thick Canary Islands fog, the KLM 747 accelerated down the runway unseen. The Pan Am jet was still taxiing ahead, hidden in the murk. Seconds later, the two giants collided, scattering wreckage across the runway. Japan Airlines Flight 123 crippled by one improper tail repair. The deadliest single aircraft crash ever began with a rushed repair years earlier. In 1978, a Japan Airlines 747 suffered a tail strike landing at Osaka. Helios Flight 522 crashed after a single cabin pressurization switch setting. An entire plane slowly passed out because one knob sat in the wrong mode. Helios Airways Flight 522 left Larnaca, Cyprus, heading toward Athens one summer morning. Nobody switched it back to automatic before the Boeing 737 departed again. As the aircraft climbed, fresh air never properly pressurized the cabin around passengers. Oxygen masks dropped, while pilots struggled with confusing alarms and checklist interpretations. Eventually, everyone on board lost consciousness, including the crew in the cockpit. The plane continued on autopilot, a ghost ship holding its programmed route. It finally crashed into Greek hillsides after fuel ran out completely. Wrong runway chosen. Sent Comair Flight 5191 off into a field. A regional jet barely reached the fence because it started from the wrong pavement. In 2006, Comair Flight 5191 prepared for departure from Lexington's Bluegrass Airport. The crew was cleared for the long runway suitable for their loaded jet. In pre-dawn darkness, they accidentally taxied onto a much shorter crossing runway instead. Taxiway construction and confusing lighting made the small Kentucky airport feel cluttered. The pilots didn't notice the missing centerline lights or unusual runway markings. They began their takeoff roll, quickly realizing the runway length was shockingly inadequate. The jet overran into a field, breaking apart beyond the runway's end. Only one person, the first officer, survived the entirely preventable mistake. United 173 ran out of fuel fixating on one warning light. A single landing gear light pulled an airliner's attention away from its fuel. In 1978, United Flight 173 was approaching Portland, Oregon with a DC-8. Pilots suspected a problem with the right main landing gear indicator. Worried about a potential unsafe landing, they held in a wide waiting pattern. They cycled the gear repeatedly, asked cabin crew to visually check wing parts. While troubleshooting, nobody fully registered the fuel state dropping toward dangerous levels. Engineers on the ground hinted about low fuel, but urgency never truly landed. Eventually, engines flamed out one by one as tanks finally ran dry. The aircraft crash-landed in a suburban area, forcing new rules on cockpit teamwork. Exxon Valdez grounded after one missed turn in Prince William Sound. A massive oil spill in Alaska started with a simple navigational oversight. In 1989, the Exxon Valdez left Valdez loaded with North Slope crude oil. To avoid ice, the tanker temporarily left its designated shipping lane at night. The captain left the bridge and a tired third mate handled the turn. Busy and possibly fatigued, he failed to steer back to the normal track. The tanker continued straight, heading toward the well-known hazard of Bligh Reef. Just after midnight, the hull tore open, dumping oil into Prince William Sound. Black slicks spread along Alaska's rugged coastline, coating seabirds and sea otters. Years of cleanup and court battles followed that one missed course correction. Costa Concordia capsized because the captain ordered one show-off detour. A modern cruise ship keeled over because somebody wanted a closer coastline selfie. In 2012, Costa Concordia sailed near the Italian island of Giglio at night. Captain Francesco Schettino ordered an unscheduled sail-by maneuver close to the shore. He hoped to give passengers and island residents a dramatic view of light. Instead, the ship struck a submerged rock, tearing a long gash along hull. Water flooded compartments, and the vessel began listing heavily to one side. Confused announcements delayed evacuation while passengers wandered crowded stairwells and dark corridors. Lifeboat deployment turned chaotic as the ship leaned further toward the rocky shoreline. The partially capsized ship became a symbol of human error and misplaced bravado. And the Sewol ferry sank after one sudden turn overloaded with cargo. Hundreds of Korean students died because a ferry handled like an overloaded pickup. In 2014, MV Sewol departed Incheon, packed with cargo and school group passengers. Cargo had been stacked high and poorly secured, far exceeding safe limits. As the ferry approached Jindo, the third mate ordered a sharp steering correction. The sudden turn sent trucks and containers shifting violently across the lower decks. The ship rolled to one side, seawater pouring in through open structures. Passengers were told to stay put in cabins, losing precious evacuation time. Rescue efforts focused outside, while many remained trapped below as listing worsened. Herald of Free Enterprise flooded when one bow door was left open. A roll-on ferry capsized minutes after departure because nobody shut the front. In 1987, the Herald of Free Enterprise left Zeebrugge bound for Dover. Cars and trucks lined the decks while passengers settled into lounges and cabins. The assistant bosun responsible for bow doors was asleep in his cabin. No system on the bridge confirmed whether the huge doors were actually closed. As the ferry gathered speed, seawater rushed straight into the open vehicle deck. Water sloshed side to side, quickly robbing the ship of stability and buoyancy. Within moments, the vessel rolled onto its side in cold Belgian harbor waters. Investigations later called it a disease of sloppiness, not one lone mistake. Hyatt Regency walkways collapsed after a small hanger rod detail change. A Kansas City hotel's lobby turned into a disaster zone over threaded steel rods. In 1981, the Hyatt Regency featured glass walkways suspended above an open atrium. Original plans called for long hanger rods passing through both walkway levels together. During fabrication, the design was changed to use shorter offset rod segments. The altered configuration doubled the load on certain beam connections without recalculation. On a busy Friday night, a dance party crowded the upper walkways. Music played as guests moved rhythmically above hundreds gathered in the atrium. Suddenly, connections failed, and both skywalks crashed onto the crowd below. The investigation became a landmark case in engineering ethics and design responsibility. Chicago's underground flood began with one misplaced river construction pile. Downtown Chicago woke up to basements filling with river water from below. In 1992, crews worked near the Kinzie Street Bridge over the Chicago River. A contractor drove a new piling too close to an abandoned freight tunnel. The steel pile punctured the tunnel roof, creating cracks beneath the riverbed. At first, only a minor leak was noticed inside the old tunnel. Attempts at patching moved slowly, paperwork churning between city departments and companies. Then, one morning, the weakened section finally gave way under the river's pressure. Water poured into miles of freight tunnels, then into basements and subway lines. Stores, offices, and trading floors suddenly found themselves ankle-deep in murky river water. Tacoma Narrows Bridge tore apart from one overlooked aerodynamic vibration mode. An elegant Washington suspension bridge literally twisted itself to pieces in the wind. The first Tacoma Narrows Bridge opened in 1940, slender and visually striking. Its narrow deck and shallow girders made it economically efficient, but aerodynamically sensitive. Even light winds made the roadway undulate, earning the nickname Galloping Gertie from locals. Engineers underestimated how steady crosswinds could feed energy into torsional oscillations. One windy November day, the bridge entered a violent twisting motion across span. Cars tried creeping off as the roadway heaved like a rolling carpet. Eventually, sections of the deck tore free and plunged into Puget Sound. The collapse pushed engineers to treat wind like an invisible, relentless marching band. Minnesota's I-35W bridge collapsed over a single, undersized gusset plate. A busy interstate bridge failed in seconds because some plates were too thin. The I-35W bridge carried traffic over the Mississippi River through Minneapolis for decades. During its original design, certain gusset plates were miscalculated and underbuilt for loads. Over years, the bridge gained extra weight from resurfacing, barriers, and construction equipment. On a summer evening in 2007, traffic slowed across the aging structure. Construction materials sat on the deck, further stressing already compromised connection points. One critical gusset plate finally fractured, triggering a broader structural failure cascade. The entire central span dropped into the river during the weekday rush hour. Investigators traced everything back to small drawings on design sheets from the 1960s. The Great Chicago Fire legend blames one kicked lantern in a barn. An entire city's fire is still linked to a cow that probably wasn't guilty. In 1871, flames tore through Chicago, destroying thousands of buildings in 2 days. The famous story points to Mrs. O'Leary's barn on the city's southwest side. According to legend, a cow kicked over a lantern during evening milking. Whether that actually happened remains doubtful, and journalists later admitted embellishment. What mattered more was the dry wooden city, crowded buildings, and strong winds. Once the blaze started, sparks leapt across streets and wooden sidewalks easily. Firefighters battled shifting flames while equipment failed and water pressure dropped dangerously. A single origin story became folklore for a disaster with many deeper causes. Bhopal gas disaster triggered when water entered one pesticide tank. One contaminated pipe created one of the world's worst industrial poisoning events. In 1984, a Union Carbide pesticide plant operated beside crowded neighborhoods in Bhopal. Water somehow entered a storage tank holding highly reactive methyl isocyanate chemical. The reaction heated the tank, building pressure and forcing safety systems offline. Operators misread early warning signs, assuming instruments were malfunctioning yet again. Late at night, a toxic cloud rolled out over sleeping families nearby. Thousands died within hours, and many more suffered lifelong health complications afterward. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and doctors barely knew what chemical they were treating. The disaster turned Bhopal into shorthand for unchecked industrial risk near vulnerable communities. Texas City refinery explosion began with one overfilled blowdown drum. A refinery startup in Texas ended with a blast felt miles away. In 2005, BP's Texas City refinery restarted an isomerization unit after maintenance. Operators overfilled a tall raffinate tower, while level indicators gave misleading readings. Liquid hydrocarbons surged into a blowdown drum designed mainly for vapor, not liquid. The vessel and vent stack couldn't handle the volume and spewed out a cloud. A large, flammable vapor plume spread across the ground toward parked vehicles. An idling pickup truck likely provided the ignition source with its running engine. The resulting explosion shattered buildings, devastated trailers, and killed workers on site. Investigators highlighted worn equipment, poor sighting, and one dangerously outdated disposal system. Therac-25 radiation overdoses came from one race-conditioned software typo. A medical therapy machine delivered massive overdoses because code trusted itself too much. The Therac-25, built in the 1980s, used software to control radiation treatments. Engineers removed many hardware interlocks, assuming the new programming would catch unsafe states. A subtle race condition let rapid keyboard input bypass certain safety checks entirely. Operators who worked quickly could change settings faster than the software updated displays. Patients lay on the treatment table while invisible beams fired incorrectly high doses. Some reported burning sensations and strange flashes before severe injuries appeared days later. Investigations initially blamed operators until repeated incidents forced deeper technical scrutiny. Eventually, the machine's code became a textbook example of lethal software assumptions. Fukushima backup generators failed because one seawall height was underestimated. A nuclear plant built for waves of one size met a very different ocean. In 2011, a massive earthquake struck off Japan's Tohoku coast, shaking Fukushima Daiichi. Reactors automatically shut down, and diesel generators kicked in to power cooling systems. Soon after, a towering tsunami swept over coastal defenses designed for smaller waves. Seawater flooded basements where backup generators and electrical switchgear were located together. Without power, pumps stopped circulating coolant through the hot reactor cores. Hydrogen built up and exploded, blowing apart upper sections of reactor buildings. Television audiences worldwide watched Japanese workers fighting invisible long-term contamination. The disaster rewrote safety assumptions about flood risk, backup placement, and worst cases. Knight Capital lost hundreds of millions from one old code switch. A single configuration flag turned Wall Street's trading floor into a runaway printer. In 2012, Knight Capital deployed new software to handle a New York exchange feature. Some servers had been updated, but others still carried dormant experimental trading code. When the system went live, one legacy flag triggered the wrong code path. Instead of modest client orders, Knight's machines sprayed the market with rapid trades. For 45 chaotic minutes, the firm bought high and sold low automatically. Stocks swung wildly as algorithms on other desks reacted to bizarre price moves. By the time Knight shut everything down, losses neared $500 million. The fiasco proved that in finance, just test in production can be fatal. A spreadsheet copy-paste error helped underestimate risk in the London whale. A few cells in an Excel sheet quietly softened the look of massive bets. At JP Morgan's London office, a trader nicknamed the London Whale built complex derivatives positions. Risk teams watched a value-at-risk model summarizing potential daily losses from the portfolio. During a model redesign, someone copied formulas but missed a crucial divide operation. The spreadsheet effectively averaged instead of summing risk, shrinking the reported exposure dramatically. Managers saw numbers that seemed comfortably within limits and allowed positions to grow. When the market turned, those trades produced billions in unexpected losses globally. Postmortems showed screenshots of the faulty spreadsheet, with one wrong formula highlighted. That tiny cell became a symbol of how human error scales inside megabanks. Reinhart Rogoff Excel formula mistake shaped austerity policies worldwide. An economic argument for harsh budget cuts partly rested on a spreadsheet slip. Two Harvard economists analyzed how countries behaved when debt exceeded certain percentages of GDP. Their influential paper suggested high government debt sharply reduced economic growth rates. Years later, a graduate student tried replicating the results using the original data. He found an Excel formula that accidentally excluded several high-debt, decent-growth countries. Once corrected, the dramatic cliff in growth looked much less steep overall. Yet by then, policymakers in Europe and elsewhere had already cited the earlier findings. Debates over austerity, stimulus, and debt ceilings had leaned on that flawed statistic. A simple range selection error became a cautionary tale for policy-driven research. The 2010 flash crash was sparked by one runaway algorithm. For a few minutes, major American stock indexes fell like an elevator cable snapping. On May 6, 2010, markets were already jittery over European sovereign debt worries. A large mutual fund launched a sell algorithm to unload futures contracts quickly. The program focused on trading volume, not price, and kept selling relentlessly downward. high-frequency trading firms pounced, rapidly buying, then dumping contracts to scalp microscopic profits. Their feedback loops amplified volatility, draining liquidity out of the order books. Within minutes, blue-chip companies briefly traded at absurdly low or even penny prices. Then, circuit breakers and human intervention helped prices bounce back almost as fast. Regulators spent years untangling how one algorithm triggered a market-wide heart attack. NORAD loaded a training tape that looked like real attacks. One wrong tape almost convinced American commanders that nuclear war had just started. In the late 1970s, NORAD monitored radar screens deep inside Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado. Operators regularly practiced with training scenarios showing incoming Soviet missiles on displays. On one shift, a simulation tape was accidentally fed into the live system. Suddenly, consoles lit up with apparent missile launches heading toward North America. Warnings raced up the chain, even reaching the National Security Advisor in Washington. Cross-checks with satellite data and other sources eventually showed nothing was actually incoming. The false alarm highlighted how training tools can resemble real threats too closely. It led to tighter procedures separating practice scenarios from live defense networks. A Soviet satellite glitch showed missiles until one colonel disagreed. Nuclear war may have been avoided because a single officer trusted his gut. In 1983, Soviet early warning satellites watched for American missile launches from high orbit. One night, the system suddenly reported several missiles rising from the United States. According to protocol, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov should have treated it as real. Instead, he noticed strange patterns and doubted that America would launch just a few. He judged the alert a probable false alarm and delayed passing it upward. Later analysis showed sunlight reflections had fooled the satellite's sensors over specific cloud formations. Petrov's quiet decision kept tension from escalating during an already icy Cold War. For many, he became the man who literally ignored the end of the world. Hawaii's false missile alert came from one wrong menu click. An entire state thought it had minutes to live because of a drop-down. In early 2018, residents of Hawaii received an emergency alert on their phones. The message warned of an incoming ballistic missile, advising immediate shelter everywhere. Inside the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency, an employee had selected the wrong option. During a drill, the live alert template sat uncomfortably close to test choices. The worker believed the exercise prompt was real and confirmed the live message. For more than 30 minutes, families hid in bathrooms and underground parking garages. Only later did a follow-up message admit there was no actual missile threat. The incident pushed agencies to rethink interface design, drills, and confirmation prompts. Lake Peigneur drained into a mine from one misplaced drill hole. A tranquil Louisiana lake briefly turned into a giant draining bathtub vortex. In 1980, an oil rig crew drilled through the floor of Lake Peigneur. They were searching for oil, but miscalculated the position above a salt mine. The drill bit punched straight into a huge underground salt cavern below. Water from the lake rushed into the mine, enlarging the hole dramatically. Boats, barges, and even trees were sucked toward a roaring whirlpool center. Onlookers watched in disbelief as the entire lake level dropped by meters. Remarkably, miners escaped through emergency routes before tunnels completely filled with water. The area's flow reversed, temporarily pulling in water from a nearby canal. St. Francis Dam failed after one geologic weakness was misjudged. Los Angeles lost a major dam overnight because the hillside beneath lied. The St. Francis Dam, finished in the 1920s, stored water for a growing city. Chief Engineer William Mulholland believed the canyon site was solid enough for concrete. In reality, the abutments included unstable ancient landslide material and weak rock layers. Cracks and leaks appeared over time, but inspections downplayed their seriousness. Just before midnight in 1928, the dam's structure suddenly gave way catastrophically. A wall of water thundered down San Francisco Canyon towards sleeping communities below. Entire ranches and towns were swept away in the darkness toward the ocean. Afterward, California overhauled dam safety laws and questioned trusting one engineer's judgment alone.